Welcome to the chaos sector. We return to the matrix. For everyone who assumes we have hit a roadblock, think again. As the chaos has pointed out, the double-edged sword theory applies in the Idaho 4 case. Brian Coberger pleading guilty changes nothing in our eyes. Some may be confused about that decision, but think about why he would make that decision. Threat of coercion? Yup. Ann Taylor didn't feel confident that she could effectively defend her client and decided it was best to fight to take the death penalty off the table. Coberger would see this as a small victory, yet let's peel back that layer. If we factor in that Taylor stated in court, before the judge, that her client had no connection to the victims means that there is a mystery as to why he would be at the crime scene. If he doesn't have a connection to the victims, then the judge naturally would ponder how and why Coberger would have committed the crime. What makes things even more complicated is the prosecution also stated that the defendant didn't have a connection to the victims. If both sides are stating the defendant didn't have a connection and there hasn't been a motive established, the judge and jury would be scratching their heads as to why the defendant committed the crime. And then there's even more to scratch their heads about, being there were additional DNA samples collected at the crime scene. Blood? If you discovered blood DNA of another male at the scene of the crime, wouldn't you investigate and track down that male as soon as possible? What type of wacky criminal investigation is this? It's definitely not normal. Now, the problem with that discovery, it places pressure on the judge to demand that the prosecution provide information about those additional DNA samples. Well, Bill the Real Deal Thompson stated he didn't think it was relevant. Wow! The FBI is in possession of those DNA samples, so the next motion that Taylor was supposed to present was to have the FBI provide the identities of those males for discovery. The defense was not provided all of the information and evidence that the prosecution claimed to have. The judge violated court proceedings by overlooking everything. Although the prosecution claimed to have Coberger's DNA on a knife sheath in the victim's bedroom, there are additional male DNA samples discovered at the crime scene. And once again, there was blood DNA of a male discovered on the stair rail. You have a suspect arrested and charged with the crime, but before, I repeat, before that suspect was arrested and charged, you also discovered DNA of other males, including blood DNA, at the crime scene. Meaning, one individual was tracked specifically despite discovering blood DNA of another male discovered at the crime scene? This is not a lawful criminal investigation. It would be unlawful, which also suggests that Coberger was being framed for the murders. Due to it being unlawful, the judge would throw the case out. Coberger would be acquitted, and a new criminal investigation would take place. Coberger may be brought back before the judge for the same charges, but we would definitely have more suspects involved due to the males who were at the crime scene. In addition, the physical engagement is very disturbing. Madison had DNA discovered underneath her fingernails, and it was reported that there was a, quote, mixture of multiple DNA samples collected. What the hell? Well, we know they didn't discover Coberger's DNA underneath her fingernails, yet wasn't he the killer? And based on claims, didn't he stalk Madison specifically? Could be considered speculation, of course, but the DNA collected from Madison's fingernails obviously proved that there was someone else in her bedroom. And if they are physically in her bedroom and she scratched them, then this is a physical struggle that took place. A judge that does not concern themselves with this crucial evidence should not be presiding over the case, which was a high-profile case at that. In this side of the double-edged sword, Coberger has been framed for the murders. It's simple. But then we have the other side, and everyone needs to accept the possibility of it.
I want to add a few things to what my colleague broke down. We pointed out early on that we had no real interests in the court proceedings. Rather, we focused on investigating, something law enforcement failed to do. We knew it would be a shit show when Bethany was convinced not to testify for the defense. Everything following that would be nothing more than a railroad in the courtroom. Ann Taylor perhaps tried initially, but we always felt she wasn't the strongest defense attorney. He needed someone who would go in and attack relentlessly. And unfortunately, Taylor didn't have that killer instinct against the state. Keep in mind, she is an attorney working for the state, who write her paychecks. Also, the pressure of defending a man out of state, accused of murdering college students in the state of Idaho, may have made Taylor apprehensive in how she defended her client. In context, Taylor is fighting against her employer to defend a man who was charged with murdering college students in a town he does not reside in. Family, friends, residents, local and state officials, and obviously law enforcement are staring Taylor down, making sure she makes the right decision. If anyone recalled, we mentioned how the defense made a mistake in claiming Coberger had autism. Even the claim that Coberger lacked the coordination and mobile skills to commit the crime within the time frame it was alleged to have been accomplished. We scrutinized the defense for this because there was absolutely no need to address any of that if you claim your defendant did not have any connection to the victims. Venturing off into behavioral and psychological attributes of your client is not refuting the alleged evidence against him. Does presenting a claim that Coberger has autism take away the alleged evidence of his DNA discovered on a knife sheath at the crime scene? Does claiming he lacked coordination and mobile skills eliminate that alleged evidence of his DNA discovered on a knife sheath at the crime scene? Negative, so it's pointless to bring it up. And it only makes it appear that Taylor was trying to gain a level of empathy for her client. Taylor walked Coberger into a plea deal, but had to make it appear she was fighting to have him exonerated. If Coberger had the greenbacks, he would have definitely hired a defense attorney, and there would have been a trial for sure. Think about it. In a setting where Taylor was more fierce, challenging the prosecution with a strong stance, everything, or at least the key issues, of what we've pointed out would back the state into a corner of being forced to acknowledge the severity of blood DNA of another male discovered at the crime scene, the severity of, quote, mixed DNA discovered underneath Madison's fingernails. This creates a conflict of the physical setting in the home and who could have been there during the attacks and murders. Taylor would have gone into trial with these key points of inquiry, right? Now, some think that it was Coberger's decision to go ahead and plead guilty. This is where things would get tricky for those deemed, quote, guilters. If those guilters believe Coberger finally accepted his fate due to murdering those college students, then who were the other individuals in the home based on DNA collected? There were additional males at the crime scene, including blood. If there was blood discovered, then someone was attacked. The blood was discovered on a stair rail, bridged between the first and second floor, meaning this male was traveling either upstairs or downstairs after being attacked. Is it possible that the same male whose blood was discovered on the stair rail is the same male who Madison scratched? Logic suggests it's highly likely, and that would explain why the state claims it's, quote, mixed DNA. Oh, never mind that one of the victims scratched and clawed for her survival. Yeah, no need to figure out whose DNA Madison gained a chunk of. Again, this is not Coberger's DNA, but based on the investigation, it would be Coberger who had murdered those students. There is clearly another suspect, And due to there being blood discovered, this has to be considered the primary suspect based on the physical engagement of a struggle. The judge has this same evidence, yet didn't think that should warrant a mistrial, forcing a new investigation. Now, some believe that Taylor couldn't do much about this shit show, as every motion she presented was ignored. Yeah, we can acknowledge that. But you have the information and evidence that will prevail in trial. You just have to keep fighting until it's time for everything to be presented before the nation. The judge may deny motions in hearings, but it's a different ballgame in a trial. So when law enforcement is summoned to testify in trial, asked about the blood of another male discovered at the crime scene, there's nothing the judge can do to stop her from grilling that individual. Or the mixed DNA discovered underneath Madison's fingernails. If it was determined to be a mixture of DNA and not reported to be identified as the suspect charged, then who could that individual be? Breaking it down even further, Taylor suggests that it's possible that this is the same blood DNA of the male discovered on the stair rail. Madison scratches this male. He, of course, bleeds, and that blood was discovered on the stair rail. You see how easy it would be to expand the crime scene to other killers? That's her job, to raise doubt in the judges' and jury's minds about the defendant's alleged guilt. Yet you can't do that if there isn't a trial. Brian Coberger wouldn't plead guilty with all of this devastating evidence that would help him avoid the death penalty and even a life sentence. Even if he was involved, he would still want trial because there were others involved in the crime. But Taylor convincing him to accept the plea, avoiding the death penalty, is her way of satisfying the state with a guilty plea and making her client feel he dodged a bullet. We believe Taylor didn't truly fight for Coberger, but also essentially, in her own way, allowed the frame to successfully be carried out.
Oh, yes, it was evident that Taylor tiptoed in this case. Yeah, sure, she mentioned the conflicting information about Dylan's witness accounts, the IgG suspicions, the alternative suspects and all, but it wasn't done from a place that felt like she wanted to bite the heads off the prosecution. It was very conservative, too conservative, and it allowed the state to gain complete control. They determined the direction every hearing went, and the judge assisted in making that determination. Sure, Taylor may have felt like the cards were stacked against her client, but this is what makes a great attorney: adversity. Facing the stiff challenge, you keep chipping away until you break through. And from what we examined, Taylor never showed she was willing to work overtime for her client. It seemed she just gave up and went through the motions, pun intended. Take Bethany's alleged exculpatory evidence as a prime example. Early on, Bethany agreed, I repeat, agreed to meet with the defense. Dylan wasn't contacted to meet with the defense. It was Bethany. So what this indicated is that the defense had information from Bethany that conflicted with Dylan's accounts, which is considered the quote star witness. The defense claimed that Bethany had exculpatory evidence that would exonerate Coberger of the murder charges. It was also stated that this information is exclusive to only Bethany, so whatever she knew, it was something specifically Bethany had experienced that night. Okay, so then the preliminary hearing comes about. And guess what happens? That's right, Bethany's attorney convinces her to stay away from testifying. That same lawyer also convinced the judge that Bethany shouldn't have to testify based on stipulations regarding the subpoena. I believe her attorney stated it was not an official subpoena, therefore she didn't have to meet the demands of the defense's summons. What this translated to was her attorney didn't want her to testify, because whatever Bethany was going to say on the stand would have caused a major breakdown in the investigation. We know this would happen because, well, we've already caused the major breakdown in the investigation as well, and it would be similar to what the chaos has exposed. A contradiction, conflict of information, witness accounts, the investigation into a specific person, you name it. Now, Taylor didn't push back against this blatant execution of damage control. It was quickly forgotten. Throughout the years, motion after motion was denied by the same corrupt judges who quashed Bethany's testimony, and Taylor never showed any real visible disgust with how her client was being railroaded. That's our perception, at least. And that image of her smiling at Coberger just gave off this deceptive vibe. It's like she told Coberger, "Well, this is all I can muster. At least you won't be facing a firing squad." And he's like, I'm innocent. What? You're giving up? I'm being framed here. I don't know any of those people. How could you just give up on me like this? Might be an exaggeration, but Taylor was not the best choice to represent Coberger. No offense to court-appointed attorneys, but we all know that they get paid regardless, and oftentimes they're working to get their client convicted of a crime just like the prosecution. They just work to negotiate the terms of the conviction, like Taylor ended up doing. Sure, we can say she tried and just couldn't get it done. Some believe this, but the chaos digs deeper into this dynamic. Her client, by her own words, had no connection to the victims. One of the victims had mixed DNA discovered under her fingernails, which wasn't identified as the alleged killer in Coberger. Blood was discovered at the crime scene of another male, with additional DNA of other individuals. The FBI has kept everything in the dark about how they obtained Coberger's DNA. Dylan's witness accounts have been obviously exposed. I mean, there is so much here for a defense attorney to work with. It's at the very least worthy of a mistrial. This should keep any defense attorney motivated to fight for their client, because there is a high probability that they can get the charges dropped against their client. As a defense attorney, this looks superb on your resume, my friends.
Exactly. Taylor would be considered one of the best defense attorneys in the state and even the nation, able to strategically break down the state's evidence, resulting in a mistrial for her client in a high-profile case that captured the nation's attention. Would be a controversial figure afterwards, but definitely an attorney whose stock would increase tremendously. Might have to relocate, can't stay in Idaho anymore. She'd be treated like a traitor. But justice is more important than some angry mob of townfolk who want to see someone bite the dust for a crime they didn't commit. Your profession demands that you defend clients who are facing criminal charges. Of course, even if they're guilty, heck, somebody has to represent them. Actually, Coberger, by law, could have represented himself. Now that would have definitely changed the dynamic of the case. But what if your client tells you they have no clue who the victims are in the murder case, never visited the neighborhood, didn't even know anyone who knew those victims, and was at the park the night of the murders? As a defense attorney, you are obligated, by the oath you take as a practitioner of law, to fight for your client and prove their innocence. Even when faced with stiff resistance, you then point that out as well. Taylor never articulated in a respectful manner that the court was not willing to broaden the scope of the investigative elements of the case. You have to make the judge think twice about their decisions, such as rejecting motions like it's a preferential choice of which type of restaurant they want to eat at. It's about evidence and information, and if it's admissible based on the relevance to the investigation and the case, a judge can't just reject it in such a frivolous manner. Ray testified and provided geolocation cell phone data that indicated Coberger was southwest of Moscow on the night of the murders. The judge basically ignored this evidence, which by his perspective was irrelevant in the case. This is an example of a judge who is being controlled by the shadow government operatives who were not going to allow Coberger to avoid being convicted for the crime. Taylor would have exposed this if she was an attorney hired by her client, but being a court-appointed attorney from the same state that is trying her client, well, she just gave up. What about Molly the magician, who claimed to be the DoorDash driver? Wasn't she supposed to testify? What about the surviving housemates and their testimonies? What about all of the so-called sealed evidence that they collected? Heck, why would the prosecution just accept a guilty plea without an actual admission of guilt before the judge and jury of his peers? Is Coberger a federal covert operative who went undercover to investigate the criminal rings in that area? Sure, he's taking the fall for the crime, but we're rounding up the real killers behind closed doors. Or was this all one big psychological experiment? When elements of a criminal case seem quite unrealistic, usually this is a sign of a psychological operation, emotional and psychological impact, an instant impact that causes the public to become compelled with the emotional and psychological impact the case provides. For college students, young and living life, dancing and joking around on TikTok, the public emotionally bonds with those victims out of empathy, compassion, relevance, understanding. The killer, a creepy loner guy, the perceived prototype of an incel, was the evil that took the joy away, and before you know it, everyone is emotionally and psychologically invested in the case. Sure, the chaos investigated, but we never become emotionally connected to anyone or anything in our investigations. An investigator does not operate from a place of emotions. Now, psychologically, yes, you have to investigate from a place of psychology because the objective is to understand every element of human behavior related to the case you're investigating.
Has anyone noticed that people who knew Coberger are all of a sudden coming out speaking positive of him? A so-called friend has recently come forward claiming he never suspected anything from Coberger. Even one of Coberger's former instructors was interviewed and basically said the same thing. But where were these individuals early on in the case when others were speaking out publicly, slandering Coberger's image? Would have been beneficial to combat the negative image being dumped out there early on. It also would cause the mainstream media to acknowledge it, making them more optimistic in their reporting. Not really we're speaking highly of Coberger now that he's being sentenced to life in prison. Oh yeah, Bill the Real Deal Thompson states Coberger had no connection to the victims. You know, if the prosecution claims that the defendant didn't have a connection to any of the victims, then this means, based on the investigation, there was nothing collected that proved he had a connection, right? Now break that down a bit more. Without a connection, then you lack a motive. Of course, some would rebuttal and say the prosecution does not have to establish a motive, but they're claiming there isn't a connection neither. In trial, would the jury be convinced that Coberger is the killer, or at the very least acted alone? If he has no connection nor motive, how does he know where to specifically go to accomplish the crime? I mean, if he doesn't have a connection to any of the victims and no motive had been established, then how did he know where individuals he didn't have a connection to specifically live? And that's the tip of the iceberg. Without a connection nor motive, nor knowing where they lived, how would he be responsible for murdering those students without any connection? So in trial, although the prosecution can rebuttal and say it is not our burden to prove a motive, the defense can simply use the claim from the prosecution against them, you see? For the prosecution to claim the defendant had no connection to the victims, this makes all of the other mysteries and suspicions in the case even more glaring. Because now, you keep digging and bringing the judge and jury's attention to the additional males at the crime scene with blood discovered as well. And to really make everyone question the charges against the defendant, link that male's blood DNA discovered with the DNA discovered underneath Madison's fingernails. Yep, there's no escaping that disturbing evidence. Because whoever that male was who left blood at the home is someone who, well, let's be honest, knew those housemates. It's not Coberger. So this male at the crime scene who left blood DNA behind has a connection to the housemates in some capacity. And because there is a connection, there is a possible motive. I mean, heck, he left blood behind at a crime scene. By default, he's a suspect. Then you have, quote, mixed DNA discovered underneath Madison's fingernails. Wait, what?
What criminal investigation somehow dismisses this as a potential trail to a suspect or even killer? Absolutely bonkers. Out of this world, I tell ya. Think about how insane this is. Amanda spent damn near 3 years behind bars, while a male who left blood behind at the crime scene is still walking around at this very moment. And to make it even more absurd, law enforcement has this male's identity and kept it a secret in their investigation. This is criminal activity. So law enforcement can't investigate a crime when they are committing a crime in the investigation they're supposed to be lawfully investigating. It's a revolving door of corruption. Nothing good will come of that malicious detective work. Of course, the FBI is pulling the strings in the background. This is how Taylor should have been attacking the state, forcing the judge to ponder about these oddities. Keep drilling this home until Dylan just comes out and tells the truth. We've done all we could in this investigation. I think it's safe to say that from the early stages, the chaos proved that Coberger was being framed for those murders. But at this point, we also have to make sure everyone doesn't get too angry about the recent guilty plea. Stay neutral in the Matrix, my friends, because you never know what's real and what isn't. That's why we present the double-edged sword theory in this case. Either he was framed for the murders, or it wasn't real. Heck, I guess there's a third blade. He was framed within the psychological operation. Now that's a lot of heavy lifting the chaos is doing. In conclusion, we advise everyone to take a step back and let the truth eventually leak out. Whatever the hell it was, the truth will make its way out of the darkness. This is the Chaos Sector.